started today. You guys have gotten your midterms back, right? Your midterm scores back, and you're picking up your midterms now. And the first thing I want to tell you is that although some of you will be freaked out a little bit, the vast majority of the class actually did pretty well, but there is, of course, a tail. And the first thing you need to remember is that that midterm is worth 1/5 of the total course. And in the end, we normalize everything on a 100-point scale. So the way to think about that is that if you're 30 points below the mean, you multiply that by 0.2, and that's like starting with a 6-point deficit on a 100-point scale. And we're not out to kill you on grades here, right? And so you could be below the mean and get a B in this course really easily, substantially below. So no one has dug such a deep hole that they can't climb out of it. And you don't have to get hundreds on everything else. You can just do normally for the rest of the course. So if you've had trouble on the midterm and you don't know why, right? If it's like, oh, I didn't go to class, didn't do any of the reading, and didn't study for, then you know what the answer is, right? But if you did all of those things and you still had trouble, then come see me, right? Come see other people in the course, right? Because we'll talk to you. And if you have questions about your exam, come see me, right? That's what I'm here for. So in the next 2 lectures, we're going to talk about the environmental nexus in the United States, okay? And in the United States, we are in a unique position globally. President Trump's administration announced on Monday that they were formally withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, a process that takes a full year. And so the US would formally withdraw the day after the next election. Now, if Trump is reelected, then of course that's just the new normal. If Trump isn't reelected, the US can rejoin after a 30-day period, but almost certainly the rest of the world would demand extra from us right, to be able to come back. And so we want to discuss, what I want to do is to tell you about what's going on inside the United States, because it is a massively moving target. I've never been in a course like this where the stuff I was teaching about for some of these lectures changed month to month. And in particular, US public opinion is changing a lot from one month to the next. And so that fundamentally changes the message of this lecture and the next one. The next lecture reflects that because it has lots and lots of detailed stuff in it. And that's because I want you to have read and to understand what the different candidates that are vying for the presidency have proposed. I want you to understand what is in this document passed by the House of Representatives called the Green New Deal. And I want you to understand what's in the alternative introduced by a guy named Matt Gaetz, who was the guy who's a Republican firebrand, a strong Trump supporter who produced a thing called the Green Real Deal. And he's a strong believer in climate change from Florida, where it's kind of hard to miss. And so I want you to have read those things. They're on Blackboard, those 2 documents, and they're actually short. The Green New Deal is something like 14 pages long. The Green Real Deal is comparable. They won't take you very long to read. Most of it is like blah, blah, blah. But then there'll be like a salient paragraph, short little things where all the meat is. So do try to arm yourself with that information, because it's going to be relevant, or should be relevant, to decisions that you need to make over the next year. I also want to talk a bit with the class about divestment, Princeton divestment. This is a new movement that has gained more steam. It's actually an old movement, but it's gained new steam. And it's how many people have a settled opinion about divesting from Princeton? Just raise your hands. I don't want to know what that. Princeton divesting from fossil fuel companies, a settled opinion. That's good. So I don't need to know what the settled opinion is, right? I wouldn't ask you to raise your hands. Okay, that way. So I've got a pretty settled opinion too. And so I'd like to talk to you about those. We may get to it at the end of this class, but we'll certainly get to it at the end of the next one. This lecture is probably the last time I'll do this one. It's necessary still to do because most people have this idea that the US is still a country full of climate contrarians. And there are climate contrarians still in the United States, but they're in the tiny minority now. We have some extremely prominent ones that have been in positions of influence that come from Princeton, and so we have a unique reason here to understand the climate contrarian phenomenon. And so I'm going to spend some time on that, but my suspicion is that this is the last time we'll need to know it. As undergraduates, people would probably ask you about it still. Last year and the year before, when I first started doing this, the students were asked about it constantly, from like their uncle at Thanksgiving, and wanted to know. And Trump's main advisor on climate until quite recently was Will Happer, who's an emeritus professor here. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so first, just a little bit of yada yada about the nexus in the United States. Climate and water problems, part of the nexus. The take-homes are that the US becomes subtropical if under business as usual. Like everywhere, it's warmer, and the wet parts of the country get wetter, and the dry parts get drier. There are more extremes, and there is also the additional problem that we have in this country, a lot of unsustainable irrigation and groundwater depletion. And so there's a reckoning in store for Western irrigation with or without the climate phenomenon. But because that region is dry historically, and the dry get drier, it's even worse with climate change. Here are just some maps. This is RCP 2.6 over here, and that's the sort of Paris compliant RCP 2.6, that's 8.5 over here rather, the sort of business as usual. Although I also think that with the technological changes we'll talk about later in the course, this is increasingly unlikely, all right? Technology change is just the cheapest form of energy now is renewable in two-thirds of their surface, and it's going to be 100% within 10 years. So I think this is unlikely. Nonetheless, this is a Fahrenheit scale. That red color is 10 degrees Fahrenheit. I have it there because although we're supposed to be, advanced undergraduates with SI units embedded in our souls, most of us still think in terms of Fahrenheit temperatures, and you know what 10 degrees means. What does 10 degrees mean? And sort of what happens when you look outside terms? And this is a map of the mean annual temperatures in the United States, okay? And you notice here that New Jersey is in this 50 to 55 band, and so 10 degrees puts you down in here. So that means that the climate that we have in Alabama, Mississippi, northern Louisiana, Georgia, and South Carolina would migrate up into New Jersey. And so, I've got the obligatory alligator in the lake. And it's because, in fact, we would be right in the middle of the alligator's home range. It would be, nice and alligatory when you're doing crew practice. And that would be, it'd make you row faster. Think about that, all right? Precipitation also changes. This is RCP 2.6, this is 8.9. There's this sort of dry slug that's moving up here, the west and southwest in the winter and spring, and in the summer you get more drying across the west, and that's of course problematic. This is groundwater depletion. You saw this slide during the water slide. I don't know if Catherine Riamaki explained this thing. This is a post in the San Joaquin Valley in 1977. The ground surface is there. What these signs mean is that the surface of the ground in 1955 was there, and that the surface of the ground in 1925 was there. And that's because they've sucked so much water out from underneath the ground that the entire gigantic region is sinking. okay? And it sank that much in 50 years. That's how much groundwater was pulled out of this place, okay? People don't realize this, but we do this all the time as a species. We jack up the land and push it back down again by injecting stuff into the ground or pulling it back out again. One of the things that people talk about is carbon capture and storage. We'll talk more about that later in the course. If we were to catch all the CO2 we produce in this country and inject it into below the ground, right, into geologic reservoirs, the average United States would jack up by 1 millimeter a year, right? Which is actually quite a bit. It's like 10 centimeters in a decade, and rather a centimeter in a decade. And so you actually jack up the whole country doing that, all right? Okay, the US food problem is not the same as the global food problem. In the US, the problem is obesity. It's about eating local. It's about processed foods. It's about animal welfare. It's about climate change and a reckoning for Western irrigation in the Great Plains. And it's about agricultural greenhouse emissions. It's not about how are we going to feed our people when the demand doubles. Because the demand isn't going to double here. And even if it does, we produce massive amounts of surplus food here. This is a graph by year that just goes to 2010, and this is exports versus imports, which shows you that we sell a large fraction of our total agricultural productivity abroad. One of the things that we'll discuss that I just added to lectures that wasn't even in there last year is that one of the main technologies for solving the food problem, and possibly for the carbon problem too, are artificial meat substitutes, all right? And so it's literally the impossible burger, and new projections now that don't have the demand for meat doubling because it looks like meat substitutes are going to take a large fraction of that meat market, all right? Which is, really very hopeful. It's a way to free up pasture land, right, to use for something else. And it's a way to reduce the emissions, particularly that come from beef. I worked on that over the weekend, and in recognition, I went to Wegmans and bought a bunch of Impossible Burgers and ate them, and, I don't know, anyway. There you go. Okay, but it was the highest yielding IPO in the U.S. this last year, right? I mean, that place is a money printing machine. Okay, the U.S. biodiversity problem isn't really the same as it is everywhere in the world, where we're worried about losing a lot of habitat. It's really, ours is a legacy of past land use, and we're on the other side of the Kuznets curve, right? So you fly from here to the Mississippi, and you look out the window of the plane, and it's 75% forested, and it was, less than 10% in 1912. And so we don't have the same sort of habitat loss problems that others do. We do have the same climate change problems that others do. And we also have this thing called the Endangered Species Act that Nixon signed. And it's been interpreted by the Supreme Court many times to mean that its intent was to halt extinctions, whatever the cost. All right? I mean, it's an amazing law when you think about it. It's like the value of an extinction is infinite, according to the interpretation of the law. You stop it no matter what the cost. Now, this has, of course, been under assault, all right? Most recently by the Trump administration, as we'll see. But it does yield a primary tool to preserve habitat. And so it's the source of which is the source of much of the conservative opposition. So environmental NGOs openly admit that they use the Endangered Species Act to preserve habitat that will then sort of preserve ecosystem function and that sort of thing, even though that wasn't its primary intent. You find an endangered species on a parcel of land, and this whatever the cost provision comes into play. Both Reagan and Bush attempted rollbacks, and another round is in the works also. But so far, it has withstood significant assault that way. It's an amazing thing. It's the only, to my knowledge, it's the only law like it in the world, right? this whatever the cost provision. So there are 2,000 species currently listed as endangered under the Act. 56 total have been delisted. 28 of those because the populations actually recovered. And that includes the American alligator, the Pacific gray whale, the bald eagle, and the lower 48 timber wolf. 10 are off the list because they went extinct, didn't work. 10 were reclassified as subspecies, which means they weren't species to begin with. 6 new populations were discovered where something was abundant that they thought was almost out. And 2 were removed for administrative reasons. I have no idea what that meant. Like somebody checked the wrong box, you know? It's like, wait a minute, you know? Yeah. It's like poison ivy was on the list. It was like, I don't know what. All right, so that's all I really want to say is for background about the United States. We're in for it. The climate problem, like everybody else, we're in for it. The ag problem, other than Western irrigated agriculture, it's not the same. We're one of the breadbaskets of the world, right? So it's a question of how much surplus we're going to be able to produce. The biodiversity problem, climate change is going to impact it, but we've got strong tools that we have used now for more than 50 years. And so that's what it is. But nonetheless, there has been, during your lifetimes, the view that the United States is a massively polarized country with perhaps a majority not believing the scientific consensus about climate change. And we're the only country, we're one of the 2, well, this maybe is true of Brazil now too, but one of the 2 major political parties has been historically hostile to the very idea that there is a scientific consensus that humans are engaged in dangerous interference in the climate system. And the point of the next several slides is to talk about that historical precedent, but then to also talk about how opinions have changed so rapidly, just like in the last year. Okay, first thing is there a scientific consensus? The answer is, of course, there's a freaking scientific consensus, you know? You look at the literature, it's like, good God, you know? And you know, you gotta understand, if I could show that there was a fundamental flaw in the scientific arguments about climate change, nothing on earth could keep me from publishing that and making a big deal out of it. Number one, because it would mean that fossil fuels could be used with impunity to help raise the rest of the world out of poverty the same way they did with us. And I would be the most famous scientist in the world. And I would get grant money like you can't believe. People say, oh, you know, the federal grant money. Give me a break. Can you imagine the corporate grant money I would get? Okay, I mean, good God, I'd be like floating in dough, all right? The point is, it's every year, every single reward in science is set up to reward those who show that everything that went before them is wrong. And you're right. It's an adversarial system. It's why there's anonymous peer review of articles so that you can attack someone with impunity. The whole system is adversarial where you have to batter your way in. And so all our rewards, nobody got a Nobel Prize for showing that everyone was right all along. You get it for showing that everyone was wrong all along. So there's absolutely no way to maintain a conspiracy because the whole system is set up to tear it down, okay? So every year, there's probably 1,000 climate science PhDs that are newly minted. They come out and they think, how am I going to make a name for them myself, you know? And if they're ambitious, they're saying, is there any way I could attack this sucker? And they come away now and say, nah, there's too much evidence. I'm going to work on some other thing, some part of it to attack maybe or something like that. So there is a massive scientific consensus because the evidence is so strong and for no other reason. It would be impossible to maintain a conspiracy in the sciences that was broad-based. You can do it in little corners of the sciences for little parts of time, but you can't maintain a broad conspiracy. The whole system is set up so that that's impossible. In 2016, when I first, I think, gave this lecture, we had a uniquely American phenomenon. One political party contended that climate scientists were wrong. You may not be able to read this. This was a Gallup environmental poll. The Republicans, 34% thought that the case for global warming was strong. It was 38% in 2016, 34% in 2018. Democrats were at about 3/4 and jumping up to 85%, so that there was a vast majority of Republicans who went the other way, and the independents were split. Also in 2016, same time, this graph shows the fraction of people who believe that science is due to, or that climate change is due to human activity in the United States. And these are Republicans with low, medium, and high education. Okay? So these are college educated or above Republicans, and there's essentially no difference with the education level. The Democrats go the opposite way, from 50% for low educated to 93% for high. This is 2016 as well. So in other words, the amount that how much you've been educated didn't matter. Somehow the political affiliation trumped other information. But this was already starting to move. This is a 2018 poll, and it shows among young Republicans that 29% thought that it was humankind, it should say, should try to stop climate change. And 28% said definitely, 29% said probably. And so together, that's well over 50%, 57% that were saying that, yeah, humankind should try to stop climate change by 2018. Those are Republicans, right? For Dems, it was 89%. Globally, by 2018 here, it was already tipped way over. So this is a poll of the same age group, 18 to 35. And it's a global poll which listed climate change as the single most important issue facing humanity already by then. So in 2018, we also started to see finally the effects of attribution science and the weirdness of the weather that was afflicting the nation. So 31% of Americans said that climate change had affected them personally by 2018, by this point in 2018. And 28% said it was affecting the nation, people they'd heard about, but not them personally. And so a total of 59% saw personal impact from these. But then by August of 2019, the picture was very, very different. So Republicans now, 20%, this is humans causing climate change, same thing. Republicans, 20% were very certain, and 60% were sort of certain. For Dems, it was 90%, but you see we've got 2/3 of Republicans now thinking, yeah, humans are causing climate change by August 2019. This is a more recent poll still. This is September 15th, 2019. This is a CBS News poll. When I selected these, I made sure that I looked at all the other polls on either side to make sure that these were representative of the range of polls that came out. 44%, how much does human activity contribute to climate change? 44% said a lot, 27% said some. So that sums to 71% of Americans. 20% says not much, but that's the actual question said some, but not very much. Okay? So you get a total of 91% that thinks there's some impact of people on climate change, which is a big difference. And then, but it's still the case that there's a big difference between parties. This is January 2019, a little earlier, in how much you think climate change should be a top priority for the government, all right? So 67% in January 2019, but only 21% for Republicans. But then that changed dramatically, even by April. So this poll got a lot of news, but it was repeated by many, many others. 96% of Democrats, of registered Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents, said that climate change was very or somewhat important. Very important, though, was 82%. 14% was somewhat important. So a vast majority of Democrats are linking this as a really important issue. And this is a 20 to 30% jump on the left since 2016. A September 2019 survey then found that 96% of 107 registered voters said it was somewhat or very important that a presidential candidate take aggressive action to slow the effects of climate change. That's a 96% number, all right? So this is the sort of thing you see when there is a phase change in a social norm, when a new idea grabs the public, the same way that acceptance of gay marriage grabbed the public and moved very, very quickly from being taboo to being normal, as people realized that they knew lots of gay people after all, right? And it's like, what's the big deal all of a sudden? This is the same thing. When you start hearing, you see the weather's weird, you start hearing from your neighbors, yeah, it looks like it's climate change. All of a sudden, these kinds of things change quickly. July 2019, there is still more concern about the issue among Dems than Republicans. This is whether or not climate change is a major threat. 94% of liberal Democrats say yes, 75% of conservative Democrats say yes, 43% of moderate or liberal Republicans say yes, but only 19% of conservative Republicans say yes. These would be people in, for instance, Trump's base. So this is still changing. This was in the summer. If you did this poll again, it's a lot higher. So the point is that American public opinion is changing very, very rapidly on this issue. There is still an entrenched base, and there always will be. There's 14% of Americans who think the moon landing was faked, okay? And so it's, so that once you get down to small numbers, all kinds of special stuff comes into play. But already we have the vast majority of the US public believing that this is a significant issue. And it's still moving rapidly, so I think this sort of US is an anomalous public outlier, opinion outlier, is something that's going to be. This is probably the last year that anybody would say it. Nonetheless, we have been a country that had a uniquely prominent number of sort of shiny credentialed scientists that were climate contrarians. Now, these are not climate scientists by and large, but they were shiny credentialed scientists, and these are the 6 most prominent that have been out there. Will Happer was a physics professor here. He's a person who he actually developed the fundamental physics behind adaptive lenses that morph themselves to make a corrective lens for the atmosphere, and in so doing allow spy satellites to show you detail that you're not allowed to know, okay? It probably includes facial recognition from space, right, given some of the stuff that Trump leaked. But it's like a big deal, right? And so he figured that out. And he did it by understanding something interesting about CO2, the radiative impact of CO2. So he's an expert on the radiative effects, radiative forcing from CO2. And he's been a prominent contrarian. He was the guy in the Trump administration that was leading the assault on climate science. Freeman Dyson is a fixture at the Institute for Advanced Study. Now, you'll probably notice that all these people are pretty old, okay? And Will Happer is at least 80. I think he's 80. Freeman Dyson is over 95, okay? He's one of the things he did was figure out how to firebomb, get a firestorm going in World War II for like the Dresden bombing, that sort of stuff. He also, if you ever look at the first of the, I don't know if you're Star Trek people at all, but the first episode of the Star Trek relaunch was Jean-Luc Picard. I can't remember what it was called. But the very first episode, they go someplace and he looks at it and he sees this gigantic structure and he goes, oh my God, it's a Dyson sphere. Well, that's Dyson, right? Anyway, what's that? Yeah, it is. Yeah, that's Dyson. So anyway, Richard Lindzen is actually an atmospheric scientist. at MIT. He's the one who's quoted in the Wall Street Journal more than any other and still is. And then there's a bunch of this is like the B team. Judith, total B teamers, right? These are all like eminent people, National Academy, all that kind of stuff, Phil's the Rose Society. Judith Curry, who's emeritus at Georgia Tech, Patrick Michaels, who's emeritus from someplace and then ended up at the Libertarian Cato Institute, Roy Spencer, who's emeritus from University of Alabama, right? So these are all old people, it's true. And so am I, so I can say that without prejudice, okay? So the question is, where does this come from? And I spent quite a bit of time on this in previous courses because people felt like they had like a responsibility since two of these characters were like locals, right? Okay, so first thing I'd like you to do is to take out your clickers and just, I'd be curious to know what you think about this. So the big question is, yeah, that is a question. What explains the existence of shiny credentialed contrarians if the evidence is so strong? First one is the contrarians are right. Most climate scientists exaggerate to push an internationalist and liberalist agenda. The contrarians are right. Most climate scientists exaggerate because they want to keep their grant money. The consensus is right. Prominent contrarians exaggerate to push a conservative agenda. The consensus is right. Prominent contrarians are paid by big oil and big coal, and none of the above. Okay? So I think that's enough. Everybody get finish, push buttons. Okay, done. And D, it's big oil and big coal and conservative agenda. Okay, cool. All right, we'll keep going with that. Yeah, it's weird. I actually, although some of them have been paid by big oil and big coal, and some of them do want to push a conservative agenda, I'm not sure either of those is right. All right. One of the most important things to understand is that these people have been eminent for a reason, and the interesting thing is that intelligence and rationality turn out to be complicated. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So what are their arguments? Well, the big argument of Dick Lindzen has been, remember the cloud albedo feedback? That the cloud albedo feedback was not a positive feedback, but was a negative feedback because of what he called the iris effect. So instead of getting brighter or darker as the climate warmed, where the clouds would absorb more sunlight, particular kinds of clouds became brighter and reflected more sunlight back to the atmosphere, which was a negative feedback. And so he said, climate change is real, but it's going to be tiny because of this giant iris effect. And you remember that the cloud albedo feedback was the least certain of the feedbacks. But of course, everybody knows that. And this has been like the prominent target of climate scientists for more than 50 years. And that's why the uncertainty here, 0.1 degrees Celsius, plus or minus 0.23, that's why it overlaps 0. Could be negative instead of a positive feedback. But you see, it can't get very big in magnitude. 0.23 is not that big an uncertainty compared to the total warming here from 1 watt of radiative forcing of 0.8. It's just not that big an uncertainty. Can't overturn the whole story. And that's why scientists have developed 6 quasi-independent ways of estimating the total climate sensitivity, how much a doubling of atmospheric CO2 would warm the planet. So you have a whole bunch of independent ways of bounding it, and it's bounded to about 3 degrees plus or minus 1 degree. And our uncertainty about the cloud albedo feedback isn't enough. And so all of this evidence was accumulating during the time that Lindzen was making his arguments, but he's never amended the argument as the evidence has piled up. That's an interesting phenomenon. Why not? Will Happer, for 30 years since the climate sensitivity is actually much lower than is published because the direct effect of CO2 in climate models has been miscalculated. He personally knows more about CO2 than anyone. And the way that the climate models, like the ones that invented here at Princeton, calculate the CO2's radiative forcing are wrong. Now, leave it aside that climate models are only one part of the evidence for anthropogenic climate change, and just take that proposition at face value. So this was really interesting because he was always saying that and everybody was always ignoring him. And then 2 years ago, or maybe 3, in the Nexus class, there was a young physicist in the room, and he said, well, that's interesting, I'm gonna try to find this out. And so he went and talked to Happer, and he's just like, I wanna know how it's going. And he said, okay, now tell me what you want the code to look like in a climate model. And so he had the guy write it down by being real nicey nice. And then he went to GFDL and looked in the climate model code and wrote it down, and the steps were identical. And he brought them back to Will and said, so what's going on here? And then Will got really pissed off when I talked to him, okay, but he has stopped saying it. So this is now resolved. It is interesting, nonetheless, right? And Will Happer was the person who was leading the push inside the Trump administration to get a review of climate science and to get the cost of climate change redone and all that sort of thing. He was the contrarian in chief. But what's really interesting is that he was a John Bolton appointee, a person who was brought in under Bolton's leadership. And it's very strange. And so when Bolton, there actually was a guy sitting in my office who had been Bolton's chief of staff when he was at the UN, when he was our UN representative. And over Twitter, he was like a Twitter nut, it came that Bolton had been booted, right? And he said, well, there goes Happer. It's the first thing he said, first thing out of his mouth. And boy, the next day, there went Happer, you know? And so, but it's still interesting. Why was a national security hawk, the most hawkish national security guy, why does he care so much about climate change that he would bring this guy in? It's really interesting to think about, right? Anybody have any guess? Yeah, one possibility would be that you just think that international agreements, like the Paris Agreement, are a bad idea, okay? And that the US needs to have sort of freedom to operate. It's very, very curious. So anyway, Happer, we're not seeing so much from anymore. The third argument is the climate sensitivity is low because the models overstate the warming. They all say that. And that was because of a period. The climate at equilibrium kind of oscillates because of all kinds of internal stuff. And if you tilt an oscillator up, like the climate is warming, the temperature is going up and the temperature is going down, temperature is going up, temperature is going down. Natural oscillation, then you tilt the whole thing up. And it becomes a series of stair steps, you see? Natural oscillation, if you tilt it up, becomes stair steps. And that's the way the climate record looked. And one of the steps was a period from, depending on how you drew it, looked like from 1999 till the late teens. And that period they were saying, see, the models are sort of in here, and the data are starting to climb beneath the models. So the models are overstating the warming. But then, of course, we got out of the stair step, and now the models are right where the data is, right? And it was, this is just a phenomenon. So the models aren't overstating the amount of warming we've seen. We also see from Will Freeman Dyson, this guy Patrick Michaels, that CO2 is good for the biosphere. You remember this number. Everybody who studies this says we're probably going to have a mass extinction because of climate change. That may be good for the biosphere. I don't know. So how can such eminent people, in the face of what is really a mountain of evidence, thousands, tens of thousands of scientists, hundreds of thousands of papers and scientific studies, how can they get it so wrong? Okay? And the first thing I want to argue is that evidentiary standards vary among scientists. One of the best examples is Dick Lindzen, who smokes because he doesn't believe there's any evidence that smoking causes lung cancer. The evidence is too weak, it's statistical, you can't believe it, it's all a hoax, okay? But if you talk to his students, he is absolutely consistent in his skepticism about everything. And there is no, so you don't get sort of like a degree in where you have to like sign an oath to follow a particular set of evidentiary standards in the science. It's sort of every woman and man from her himself, right? And so Dick Lindzen just has more skeptical evidentiary standards than anyone, right? He literally chain smokes because of this. Okay, amazing. I love that. Spencer, who's a prominent contrarian, also a prominent guy in the Wall Street Journal. Here's a great quote from him. I finally became convinced the theory of creation actually had a much better scientific basis than the theory of evolution. Okay? All right? So whether or not you believe in creation science, if you're a scientist and you read the scientific record and use what scientists use to decide among theories like parsimony, it's really hard to come to that conclusion, right? And without some sort of additional set of decision rules that you're bringing into the story. So the point is that, so Will Happer's motivation is perhaps more complicated. The point is that every one of these people has a story about how they came by their skepticism. And that story is not necessarily or primarily that they were paid to believe it or something like that. There are other ways to sort of think about it. And so the way I like to think about it is that, there are people who believe all kinds of things. There's a prominent Nobel laureate that doesn't believe that HIV causes AIDS. All right? And so evidentiary standards are complicated. People are complicated beings. You expect a minority of shiny credentialed scientists to behave in this way. And also, I do want to point out that in any scientific controversy that is a big one, like continental drift or evolution, the demography of the warring parties has been diagnostic in the past. In the end, those that defend to the death eventually just age out and die, all right? Literally. The age structure is such that when the evidence gets strong, the young people come in and say, can I attack this? No, it's just not a good mark because there's too much evidence. And so the distribution on the one side just starts to reflect the age distribution of all scientists and all the young people over there. And the other side just kind of ages out. And you can look at this picture, right? Right? And so that I think is it. And that's not ageist. That's just an observation about the way. No, it really is. I mean, it is just you could say it's ageist, but the point is that, well, you can forget about it. I'm over 60, so I could say that maybe. How's that? I got credit. Who are the young scientists? Who are the young contrarians? To a person, they're not really climate scientists anymore. So this guy, Bjorn Lomborg, wrote a book called The Skeptical Environmentalist. He's around a lot. He's an adjunct professor at the Copenhagen Business School. That's what he is. This is one. Roger Pilkey Jr. is in the Wall Street Journal a lot. He's in the Department of Athletics at the University of Colorado. He's well known for having shown that in the United States, the fraction of GDP we spend on flood damage is decreasing. See, so there's no, okay. So, yeah, exactly. There you go. So why is this a useful metric, right? I mean, our GDP is exploding. It's getting really big, right? So if you want to know if there's more extreme precipitation, you can actually look at rainfall data, okay? And extreme precipitation is in fact increasing all over the country, right? So the point is that this phenomenon, I think this is the last time I'm going to give this lecture because I think that Will's probably not coming back to the Trump administration. Okay, so I've got a bunch of stuff that I'd like you to know from this talk, but in the time we have left, which is only 5 minutes or so, I'd like to talk a little bit about divestment, all right, in Princeton, because I think this is something that actually matters. It's the decisions that you guys have to have a position on, I think. Next time we're going to talk about the political situation inside the United States, and I also have it. We can continue the divestment talk then. Let's actually just do a quick clicker poll, okay? So yes, if you support that Princeton divest from companies that sell fossil fuels, and no if you think Princeton should not divest from those. Everybody knows what that means? Okay? All right, so let's start. A is yes, divest. B is no, don't divest.
What if we don't know?
Then C. Okay. C is good. 2, yeah. Okay, I'm going to kill it. Let's see what people say. So the A's have it. People want to divest. Does anybody want to do a quick defense of a divestment argument? Can you give me somebody who thinks they've got a great divestment argument? Would you be brave enough to sort of let us have it? Come on, don't be shy. Nobody's going to bite you. Okay, good. Yeah, is there a mic? Yeah, here's one. This guy down here. Thanks, Rush.
I think the baseline, and you already mentioned it at the top of the lecture, is just frankly that it's no longer, or that renewables are becoming a lot cheaper, and the industry itself is thriving. So to continue to invest in what is seemingly a dying industry for the most part is that it's
Yeah, so your argument then is that it's a lousy investment. It's like we won't make any money. It's an economic, not a moral argument. Business decision.
Also, personally.
Okay, yeah, another? Back. Yeah, ooh.
Well, in addition to the university investment being a pretty sizable investment in the industry, the name Princeton has a lot of symbolic meaning. I've already seen blow up on Twitter the fact that none of the Ivy Leagues have divested yet. And if Princeton, which is supposed to be the leading intellectual center, at least the US, is unable to even listen to their own scientists, what is that showing the rest of the world?
Okay, great. Somebody on the opposite side? Yeah, go ahead. Down here? Huh? Oh, was there somebody else on the opposite side? Sorry. Yeah.
I think it's just the timing, because I think you said in one of the elections, there's a lot of money that's already invested in infrastructure that takes time to phase out. So it's not economically possible just to stop from the investing. There should be a plan to over time to transition, but it's a business. I don't know, you were just a business. It's just not real.
So thank you. That's good. So we're going to continue this next time, but please do think about it, right? I should let you know that Professor Nixon and I are on opposite sides of this issue. Professor Nixon believes we should divest. He's a veteran, right? Guy's got total street cred. He's a veteran of the South African protests where divestment was a significant factor in creating an end to apartheid. He took personal risks and believes that the symbolic value is really what drives it. Me, I'm much more worried about consistency. No one is proposing that Princeton not use fossil fuels anymore. I think that none of those that believe in divestment are willing to give up all of the fossil fuel derived stuff that they use all the time. And so this gets back to your argument. Is it time yet when you can't really be consistent? In the South African case, I divested and I boycotted all South African products. Okay, so we'll get back to this more later. But I'm a bad guy. I'm on the wrong side of this one. All right, told you. Okay.